and war is destruction. It tears apart nations, bodies, and spirits alike. But hidden among the brutality of the Second World War, and there were moments of humanity so unexpected that they left even hardened soldiers stunned. For German prisoners of war, and captured on distant battlefields and shipped across oceans, one of the most shocking discoveries was not a weapon, a tactic, or even a new form of technology. And it was the way the Americans healed. To the German mind, trained in the efficiency of their own military medical corps, and treatment from the enemy should have been cold, limited, and driven by strict necessity. Yet, when they entered American hospitals, clinics, and prison camp infirmaries, they found something entirely different. They encountered a level of care, compassion, and medical advancement that many could scarcely believe. And this is the story of how German soldiers and civilians were confronted with American medicine. A revelation that reshaped how they viewed their enemy, and the war, and in some cases humanity itself. Background medicine before the encounter. At the dawn of World War II, Germany was not without its medical achievements. German physicians had pioneered advances in surgery, anesthetics, and bacteriology, and yet the Nazi regime's obsession with racial ideology corrupted much of this progress. German medical science was redirected into eugenics programs and unethical human experiments and brutal wartime triage systems. Medicine in the Wehrmacht was pragmatic and efficient, but often merciless. And field hospitals were designed for rapid stabilization, not long-term care. Soldiers with treatable but disabling wounds were often written off, and their future deemed a burden to the Reich. Resources were stretched thin, and as the war dragged on, German medics faced shortages of penicillin and blood plasma and even basic antiseptics. By 1944, amputation was frequently the only option for battlefield injuries that, in other armies, and might have been treated with more advanced care. In contrast, the United States entered the war with a different philosophy, and American medicine was fueled by abundant resources, cutting-edge innovation, and a focus on preserving the soldier not only as a fighter, but as a human being. And the discovery and mass production of penicillin became a turning point. Blood transfusion programs, portable surgical units, and psychiatric care were brought directly to the battlefield. And above all, American medical ethics, while not without flaws, and leaned toward saving lives regardless of nationality. For captured Germans, this was not what they expected. Main events and encounters with American medicine. First shock, the hospital wards. When the first waves of German POWs arrived in the United States after Operation Torch in North Africa, and they expected harsh conditions. Rumors had circulated that American prison camps were brutal, that the wounded would be neglected or even executed. Instead, they were taken to hospitals staffed with doctors and nurses who treated them with the same diligence as American soldiers. And one German officer later recalled the astonishment he felt when a U.S. nurse changed his bandages daily, carefully disinfecting his wounds. He had braced himself for indifference, even cruelty. Instead, he was treated with gentleness, and his American caregivers called him Sir, not enemy. For many Germans, this was the first exposure to penicillin, and while their comrades in Europe often died of gangrene or blood infections, American hospitals were saving men who would have otherwise been lost, and Germans who had resigned themselves to death walked out alive. And the miracle of penicillin, the mass production of penicillin by American pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, revolutionized wartime medicine. What had been a scarce experimental drug in 1952 was, by 1944, produced in quantities sufficient to treat thousands of wounded soldiers daily. And German POWs suffering from infected wounds or pneumonia were stunned to see the drug's effect. In Germany, and such cases often meant amputation or a slow death. In America, recovery could be swift. For many, this seemed like a miracle. And soldiers who had cursed their captors found themselves alive because of them. And blood and plasma, equally astonishing was the American mastery of blood transfusion and plasma replacement. The Red Cross and U.S. and Army organized a vast system of blood donation, transporting plasma across the Atlantic to save lives on every front. And German soldiers in American care witnessed blood bottles and plasma packs lined up in rows, ready for use, and a wounded man who had lost half his blood could be stabilized in hours. In their own army, and such supplies were scarce and often reserved for officers or elite units. Here, in the enemy's hands, and ordinary soldiers received the same life-saving care as generals. Psychological care, perhaps most unexpected, was the American approach to mental health, and the Germans had no concept of combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress as a condition to be treated. In the Wehrmacht, exhaustion was seen as weakness, and often punishable by harsh discipline. Yet in American facilities, German poilus observed their guards and captors receiving psychological counseling and rest periods, and even recreation to restore mental health. While prisoners themselves were not always given the same level of attention, and the mere existence of such care challenged their understanding of what an army owed its men. And civilians in relief, the shock was not confined to prisoners of war. As the Allies advanced into Europe, and German civilians encountered American field hospitals and relief stations, and families who had suffered from years of scarcity suddenly saw American medics handing out food, treating sick children, and distributing medicines long unavailable in Germany. And one German mother later described her astonishment when American doctors provided antibiotics for her son's infection. She had expected hostility instead, and she received compassion. For her, it was the first time she realized the enemy was not the monster her government had described. Aftermath and changing perceptions. The effect of these encounters was profound, and German POWs repatriated after the war often spoke with astonishment about the fairness and humanity they experienced in American camps. For some, and the medical treatment they received changed their perception of America forever. And historians note that this played a subtle but important role in post-war reconciliation. And thousands of Germans who returned home carried stories of how the enemy saved their lives, treated them with dignity, and showed them a different model of civilization. These testimonies contrasted sharply with stories from the Eastern Front, and where captured soldiers faced starvation, brutality, or death in Soviet hands. The contrast left a mark. For many Germans, America became not just a conqueror, but a country that embodied progress, abundance, and, at times, mercy. Conclusion: the Second World War was fought with tanks, planes, and guns, but also with medicine. In this hidden battle, and America's ability to heal left an impression just as powerful as its ability to destroy. For German prisoners and civilians, and the revelation of American medical treatment was a turning point. It showed them a side of war they had never expected: compassion from an enemy. And these moments did not erase the horrors of the conflict, nor did they erase the suffering inflicted by both sides. But they offered a glimpse of a world where even in the darkest hours, humanity could break through the violence. And for those who lived through it, and the memory of American medicine remained not just as a scientific marvel, but as a testament to the possibility of mercy amid war. War has always been remembered for the roar of artillery, the smoke of burning cities, and the cries of soldiers on the battlefield. But beneath the chaos, there were quieter revelations that left deep impressions on those who lived through it. Among German prisoners of war, and one of the most startling discoveries during their captivity in America was not a new weapon or an unexpected tactic, but the way their enemy practiced medicine. And what they encountered was so far removed from what they had known in their own ranks that many could not believe it was real. And when the first German captives were transported from North Africa to the United States, their minds were filled with rumors. And some had heard that American camps were harsh, that the wounded were neglected, and that the enemy might even use them for labor until they died. Instead, and many of them were led into hospital wards where white-coated doctors and attentive nurses worked with a calm precision that seemed alien after years of war. And soldiers with wounds festering from shrapnel or infection expected amputation or dismissal as hopeless cases. What they received was treatment, daily care, and in many instances, a chance at survival. For many, the first great shock was the discovery of penicillin. In Germany, and infections that began in the field often ended in death. Supplies of antibiotics were scarce, and what little there was often reserved for the elite or high-ranking officers. In American hospitals, and German soldiers saw penicillin administered as though it were commonplace. Wounds that would have blackened and spread with gangrene were cleansed and healed, and lungs heavy with pneumonia were restored with astonishing speed. For men who had resigned themselves to slow decline, this seemed nothing short of miraculous. And they were bewildered that their enemy, who had every reason to hate them, was willing to spend resources to keep them alive. And blood transfusions were another revelation. In the German army, blood was in short supply and often prioritized for those the regime considered valuable. In America, there existed a vast network of donations collected by the Red Cross, stored and transported across the ocean in quantities that staggered the imagination. German prisoners watched as bottles of plasma were lined up in rows and as common as rations. A soldier pale from blood loss could be stabilized in a matter of hours. And what shocked them further was that this generosity extended to ordinary enlisted men. And the same lifelines that saved American soldiers were used without hesitation on the very enemies they had fought on the battlefield. Beyond the physical, and there was also the American approach to the mind. The Wehrmacht recognized exhaustion and fear only as weaknesses to be punished, and a soldier who faltered risked disgrace or worse. In contrast, Americans treated what they called battle fatigue as a condition to be managed, not condemned. And German prisoners saw American servicemen being allowed rest, counsel, and care for their minds as well as their bodies. And the idea that an army would invest so much effort in preserving the mental health of its men astonished those who had come from a system where a human life was measured only by its usefulness to the state. And the revelations were not confined to the prisoners alone. German civilians, in the war's final stages, and encountered American field hospitals as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe. And villages battered by bombing and starvation suddenly found American medics distributing medicines, food, and even tending to children who had known nothing but scarcity. And mothers who had been told to expect cruelty from the Americans instead saw their children treated with antibiotics and bandages. And these moments were disorienting and breaking apart years of propaganda and forcing ordinary people to confront a new and unsettling truth about the enemy they had been taught to despise. And some prisoners later spoke of the way American nurses treated them with small gestures of dignity, addressing them politely, and changing their dressings with care, even when the wounds were ugly and the men were German. Others remembered the surprise of being placed in clean beds and given meals that exceeded anything they had tasted for years and provided care that in Germany would have been unthinkable for a captive. And it was not only the technology and supplies that shocked them, but the very ethos that guided the treatment. Here, and the enemy had chosen to see them as patients rather than as disposable foes. And historians looking back at these encounters often note how deeply they influenced those who experienced them. And thousands of German prisoners returned home carrying stories of how they had been healed by American medicine. And these accounts stood in stark contrast to those who had been captured on the Eastern Front, where survival was a gamble and mercy was rare. And the comparisons shaped perceptions in subtle but lasting ways. For many Germans, and the United States became not only the nation that defeated them, but also the nation that had shown them a face of humanity they had not expected in war. And war is often remembered for its brutality, for the devastation it leaves behind, and the relentless pace of destruction that swallows entire nations. And yet within that same chaos, there were moments that defied expectation and left powerful impressions on those who lived through them. Among German soldiers, and especially those taken as prisoners of war, one of the most startling discoveries was not a weapon or a strategy, but something far more human, and something that seemed almost impossible in the context of conflict. It was the way Americans practiced medicine, the way they healed rather than destroyed, and the way their resources and compassion reshaped the lives of men who had expected only indifference or cruelty at the hands of their captors. And when German soldiers were transported across the Atlantic after being captured in North Africa and Europe, they braced themselves for the worst. And the rumors spread quickly among them, tales of harsh conditions, neglect, or even execution in enemy camps. The reality that met them was entirely different, and instead of bare neglect or indifference, they found themselves in hospital infirmaries where American doctors and nurses treated them with a professionalism and care that many had never imagined possible. And for men who had come from the front lines, where wounds often meant death or amputation, the experience of being dressed, stitched, and cared for was disorienting. They could not reconcile the image of the enemy they had fought with the reality of the hands that now worked to save them. And the most dramatic revelation came in the form of penicillin. In Germany, medicine was stretched thin by the demands of war, and antibiotics were not widely available to ordinary soldiers. Infections often ran rampant, turning survivable wounds into death sentences. And in American hospitals, however, penicillin was administered almost routinely, and prisoners who arrived feverish and near death from infected wounds watched as the drug reversed their conditions within days. And a man who would have been written off by German medics as lost was suddenly walking again. For many prisoners, and it was their first glimpse of the vast difference in resources and medical priorities between the two nations. And they described it as nothing short of a miracle, a turning point that altered not only their health but their understanding of the enemy's power. And blood transfusions and plasma supplies were another shock. The American system for collecting, storing, and transporting blood was unprecedented in scale, and German prisoners who had lost blood on the battlefield had expected to fade away, but instead they saw bottles of plasma lined up in neat rows, ready to be used. The sheer abundance seemed impossible to them, an industrial miracle fueled by thousands of anonymous donors back in the United States. And what left the deepest mark was not only the efficiency, but the fact that these resources were shared with them, the enemy. An ordinary German soldier, and lying in an American hospital bed, received the same lifeline as any American fighter. In their own system, such privilege would have been rare and reserved for higher officers or carefully selected individuals. In America, it was simply standard. The shock extended beyond the body to the mind, and the Wehrmacht offered no true mental strain, and exhaustion was treated as cowardice or failure. And soldiers who could no longer endure the pressures of combat were punished or discarded. In contrast, American forces openly acknowledged what they called combat fatigue, offering treatment, rest, and psychological care, and German prisoners observed this approach with disbelief. They had been taught that an army demanded unyielding obedience and sacrifice, and yet here was an enemy willing to preserve even the spirit and emotions of its men, while German captives did not always benefit from the same treatment, and the very existence of such practices challenged their assumptions about what an army owed to those who fought for it. And the encounters were not limited to prisoners. Civilians across occupied and liberated Europe also witnessed American medicine at work. And German families who had spent years under shortages and medical neglect suddenly saw American doctors and medics providing treatments to children and delivering antibiotics and distributing bandages and supplies that had long since vanished from German shelves. In some villages, and mothers carried sick children to American field hospitals and watched in disbelief as they received the kind of care they thought was no longer possible. And the enemy who had bombed their cities was, in these moments, the one who brought relief. This contradiction was difficult to reconcile, but it planted seeds of doubt in the propaganda that had painted Americans as cruel and inhuman. For many German soldiers, it was the small details that lingered, the way nurses addressed them with formality rather than contempt, and the way meals were provided, the better than anything they had eaten in months, and the way their wounds were cleaned and stitched even when they were the enemy. They were astonished that in this environment they were not disposable, and they were treated as human beings, something their own leadership often denied them in the field. To some, the experience created a sense of gratitude that they carried for the rest of their lives. To others, it was a bewildering contradiction, and a reminder that the world was not as simple as they had been told. And historians later noted how these experiences became part of the larger story of post-war memory. German prisoners returned home with accounts of fairness and dignity, and above all, survival owed to American medicine. The stories spread quietly among families and communities, and shaping perceptions in ways that military victories alone could not. When compared with those who had been captured by the Soviets, the contrast was stark, and the same war had offered two entirely different fates, and for those who lived because of American medicine, the lesson was never forgotten. And war leaves scars that run deeper than the battlefield, scars that touch not only the landscape, but the minds and bodies of those who lived through it. And soldiers often marched into combat believing the enemy would be ruthless, unforgiving, and unwilling to show mercy. And for German soldiers during the Second World War, that belief was deeply ingrained. Years of propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal and careless, and men who would treat captives as subhuman and discard the wounded without thought. Yet the reality many encountered after capture told a very different story. And what shocked them most was not some terrifying weapon or overwhelming tactic, but the simple fact that American medicine treated them with a level of care and humanity they had not expected to receive from anyone, and least of all from an enemy. For many German prisoners brought across the ocean, the journey itself was filled with dread. They feared harsh camps, starvation, and neglect. The war had stripped them of hope, and they expected captivity to be little more than a slow decline. Instead, many arrived in facilities where doctors and nurses greeted them not as foes to be punished, but as patients to be healed. And German soldiers with shrapnel wounds, burns, or broken limbs found themselves placed in clean beds, given food and water, and treated with precision. And what unsettled them most was the dedication of the staff, who tended to their wounds carefully and with professional detachment, and refusing to let hatred interfere with their work. The most dramatic difference they witnessed was the American use of penicillin in Germany, and this medicine was still a rarity reserved for the select few and nearly impossible to find by the time the war dragged into its later years. And many Germans had grown used to the sight of comrades dying from infections that began with small cuts or bullet wounds. Amputation was often the only hope, and even then survival was uncertain. In America, penicillin was used in large quantities, available to ordinary soldiers and even to prisoners of war. And men who expected to lose limbs watched their wounds close and heal, and those who believed they were on the brink of death from fever or infection suddenly recovered within days. To the German prisoners, it seemed miraculous and a sign that the enemy had mastered not only weapons, but the art of saving lives in ways they had never imagined. And blood transfusions and plasma treatment added to this sense of astonishment. The American system of collecting blood donations on a massive scale and storing them and delivering them to the front lines and to hospitals across the country was unlike anything the Germans had seen. And prisoners who had suffered blood loss in battle saw bottles of plasma hanging in neat rows, ready for use. And they were bewildered that this abundance existed, and even more shocked that it was offered to them, the enemy. In their own army, supplies had been scarce, and often saved for officers or elite units. Here in captivity, ordinary enlisted men were given the same life-saving care as American troops. And this sense of equality in treatment challenged everything they had believed about the way an enemy would treat them. Beyond the physical care, and German prisoners also noticed the way Americans treated psychological wounds. In the Wehrmacht, mental exhaustion was not recognized, and soldiers who broke down under pressure were punished, humiliated, or simply cast aside. The Americans, however, openly discussed what they called battle fatigue and provided treatment, rest, and even counseling to their own soldiers. And though German prisoners did not always benefit from these practices directly, and they saw their captors cared enough for the mental health of their own men to give it serious attention. This was alien to them, and many later recalled how strange it was to see an army that sought to preserve the minds as well as the bodies of its fighters. And the shock extended far beyond prison camps. As the Allies advanced into Germany and occupied towns and villages, civilians also encountered American medical practices, and families whose children had been weakened by years of malnutrition and lack of medicine found American field hospitals distributing food, bandages, and even life-saving drugs. And mothers who had feared the arrival of enemy soldiers often described their disbelief when American medics treated their children with kindness. And a boy with pneumonia who would likely died in a German town without antibiotics suddenly survived because American doctors intervened. And for many civilians, this was their first direct experience of the Americans, and it clashed with everything they had been told by Nazi propaganda. And the details that stuck with prisoners and civilians alike were often small but unforgettable. And German soldiers remembered the way nurses would address them politely, even as they bandaged wounds caused by battles against their own side. And others recalled the taste of hospital meals, simple but nourishing, that felt luxurious compared to the rations they had grown used to. And still others described the cleanliness of American wards, where sheets were washed and floors scrubbed, and something almost unimaginable after the filth of front-line medical stations. And what shocked them was not only the resources on display, but the decision to extend those resources to them. They were not Americans, not allies, and not even neutral strangers. They were enemies, yet they were treated as though their lives still had value. And these experiences would stay with many for the rest of their lives. When prisoners of war eventually returned home, and they carried stories of survival that seemed incredible to those who had not been there. Some credited American medicine with saving their limbs and their eyesight, or even their lives. These testimonies spread through post-war Germany, shaping the way many viewed the United States in the years to come, and captured soldiers who had expected cruelty, instead carried back memories of bandages, antibiotics, transfusions, and dignity. War is most often remembered through the roar of guns, the devastation of cities reduced to rubble, and the endless columns of soldiers marching into uncertain fates, but hidden within that destruction were moments that revealed unexpected truths about humanity. For German soldiers captured during the Second World War, and one of the greatest surprises they encountered was not the sheer size of American armies or the might of American industry, but the way their captors practiced medicine. And It was a revelation that left many stunned and struggling to reconcile what they had been taught with what they experienced firsthand. And, from the beginning of the conflict, German medical services had been built on efficiency and necessity, and shaped by shortages and guided by the harsh pragmatism of a state at total war. The Wehrmacht had talented doctors and skilled surgeons, but as the years went on, resources became scarce, and compassion was often sacrificed to keep the war machine moving. And wounded soldiers were patched up if they could be returned to the front quickly. And those with injuries too severe or infection too advanced were often abandoned or subjected to amputations without hope of further care. And medicines like penicillin were rare, guarded for only the most important cases. In this system, and survival often depended not on skill or bravery, but on luck and rank. And for German prisoners shipped across the Atlantic after battles in North Africa and Europe, the expectation was that things would only grow worse. Rumors told of starvation, neglect, and cruelty at the hands of the Americans. Many entered their new surroundings with dread, and convinced that wounds left untreated would fester and kill them slowly in captivity. Instead, they were met with hospitals that looked nothing like the crude field stations they had grown used to. Clean sheets, orderly wards, and doctors who worked with steady hands greeted them. And the contrast between expectation and reality was so great that many described it as one of the most disorienting moments of their lives. And the use of penicillin in America was one of the most astonishing differences. In Germany, soldiers knew the terror of small wounds turning deadly, and infections spread quickly in the filth of the front, and without effective antibiotics, even minor injuries could mean death, and amputation was often the only tool left to German doctors. But in American hospitals, penicillin was used widely and with remarkable results, and prisoners who believed themselves doomed watched their bodies recover with speed they could hardly believe. Fevers broke, swelling reduced, and men who had already resigned themselves to death found themselves walking again. To those who had lived under scarcity, and the sight of penicillin being administered, if it were routine, was overwhelming, and they carried that memory long after the war ended. And equally startling was the abundance of blood and plasma. The American system for collecting and distributing blood was vast, and organized on a scale the Germans had never seen. And plasma was collected in enormous quantities from volunteers back home and transported across oceans to soldiers and prisoners alike. And German captives witnessed rows of bottles prepared for transfusions, a lifeline for men who had lost staggering amounts of blood in battle. And it seemed almost unthinkable to them that such precious supplies would be shared with enemy soldiers. In the Wehrmacht, and those resources had been rare and carefully rationed, often directed only toward officers or elite units. In American facilities, an ordinary German prisoner received the same treatment as any American private. This equality in care shocked them more than the abundance itself, for it challenged everything they had been told about how the enemy would treat them. Beyond the physical healing, German prisoners also noticed differences in how Americans treated the mind. In their own army, exhaustion was punished and despair was labeled cowardice. And soldiers who faltered under the weight of endless combat were shamed or discarded. But in American camps, they observed something foreign, and the recognition of what was called battle fatigue. American soldiers were allowed periods of rest, given counseling, and even granted medical attention for their mental strain, while German captives did not always receive such care themselves, and the very fact that their captors valued the mental health of their men was shocking. It revealed a philosophy of war in which the human being, and not only the soldier, mattered. As American armies moved deeper into Europe, civilians too witnessed this unexpected aspect of their conquerors, and towns devastated by bombing raids and shortages suddenly saw American medics setting up field hospitals, distributing medicine, and and offering treatment to children and the elderly. And mothers who had braced for cruelty instead saw their sick children given antibiotics and their families handed supplies. For those civilians, and the encounter left memories just as profound as those carried by soldiers. And it was difficult to reconcile the bombers that had shattered their homes with the doctors who now saved their children. But the contradiction stayed with them nonetheless. Small moments often carried the greatest weight, and German soldiers remembered the quiet voice of a nurse addressing them with respect as she cleaned their wounds, and the steady hands of a doctor stitching them as if their lives mattered, the taste of hospital meals that felt like a luxury compared to front-line rations. And they were astonished not just by the abundance of resources, but by the decision to use them on men who were supposed to be nothing more than enemies. And these experiences unsettled them, yet they also opened their eyes to the possibility that war did not erase every trace of humanity. And when the war finally ended and prisoners were returned to their homes, these memories traveled back with them. And families heard stories not of cruelty and neglect, but of bandages, plasma, penicillin, and dignity. And German communities that had been steeped in years of propaganda began to see a different side of their former enemy, and filtered through the voices of those who had lived in American hospitals and camps. And it was a revelation that shaped not only individual memories, but the broader way in which America came to be seen in post-war Germany. And war often leaves behind stories carved in ruins, tales of destruction, and memories of endless marches across scorched landscapes. And yet within that devastation lie unexpected glimpses of humanity that linger far longer than the echoes of artillery. And for many German soldiers captured during the Second World War, and the greatest surprise they faced was not the overwhelming power of American tanks or the thunder of Allied bombers, but the astonishing medical care they received at the hands of those they had been told were ruthless enemies. And this discovery unsettled them in ways few could have imagined, and for it stood in sharp contrast to the world of deprivation and harsh pragmatism they had known under the Wehrmacht in Germany's war machine. And medicine was functional, calculated, and often brutal. Doctors were skilled, many among the best in Europe, but resources grew scarce as the war dragged on. And compassion was increasingly treated as a luxury the state could not afford. Bandages were reused until they fell apart, morphine supplies dwindled, and penicillin, when it was available at all, was reserved only for the most critical officers or high-value cases. For the common soldier, and a festering wound could mean the end of his usefulness, and amputations were frequently performed not out of hope for recovery, but simply to stop infections before they spread. And the entire system placed the needs of the army above the lives of individuals, and men who could not return quickly to the front were often left behind. And this cold efficiency was a fact of life that German soldiers carried with them as they were taken prisoner. Captured men expected little more than neglect from their captors, and convinced that the Americans would allow them to suffer or die slowly. And propaganda had painted a grim picture of enemy camps where cruelty and starvation was certain. And so they braced themselves for the worst. And what greeted them instead was a disorienting shock. American hospitals were clean, organized, and staffed with men and women who treated their wounds with skill and calm precision. The sight of crisp, white sheets, orderly wards, and an abundance of medical tools stood in sharp contrast to the rough conditions of German field stations. For many, it felt less like captivity and more like stepping into an entirely different world, and one they had been told could not exist. The most powerful symbol of this difference was penicillin, and German soldiers had learned to fear the smallest cuts and the most ordinary scratches, for they could swell into raging infections that consumed the body from within. Without antibiotics, and lives were cut short by wounds that should never have been fatal. In American hospitals, Penicillin was not a miracle whispered about, but a routine treatment, and applied swiftly and with confidence. Men who had resigned themselves to fever and death watched in disbelief as their bodies responded, and their infections receding with a speed that seemed almost unreal. Amputations that would have been certain under German care were avoided, and soldiers who expected to lose limbs found themselves walking again. And the experience left many struggling to comprehend how their enemies had mastered such abundance while their own nation could not provide even the simplest doses for its fighters' blood, and plasma transfusions offered another stunning revelation. And America had built a system for collecting and distributing blood on a massive scale, supported by countless volunteers back home. And German prisoners saw the bottles of plasma lined up, ready for use, and realized that this supply was not limited to officers or elite units, but extended even to men who had fought against the very system providing it. And transfusions saved lives on a daily basis, and the knowledge that American civilians had willingly donated their blood for unknown soldiers, and including prisoners, was a truth that many German captives could not easily process. It challenged their understanding of loyalty, hierarchy, and the value of human life in wartime. The difference extended beyond the body to the mind, and German soldiers had been conditioned to believe that exhaustion or despair was weakness, often punished as cowardice. And men suffering from the mental strain of endless combat were shamed or discarded by their superiors. In contrast, American forces recognized what they called battle fatigue, offering rest, counseling, and medical attention to those overwhelmed by the psychological toll of war, while German prisoners did not always receive such treatment directly, and the very existence of this philosophy left them astounded. And to see an army willing to acknowledge the mind as part of the soldier's health was to witness a humanity absent in their own system, civilians, too, and felt the reach of this medical generosity. In towns devastated by bombings, American medics often set up temporary hospitals, and treating not only their own men, but also local populations, including children and the elderly. And German mothers expecting cruelty found instead doctors tending to their sick children, offering medicines that had long vanished from German pharmacies. And stories spread of penicillin given freely to civilians, of plasma shared with those who had nothing to offer in return. And for people who had been taught to fear their conquerors as merciless occupiers, and these acts created confusion, but also gratitude that endured for years. Afterward, memories of these encounters were carried home by prisoners once the war ended. And they told families of the strange paradox of American power and of a nation capable of unleashing devastating destruction from the sky, but also willing to heal the very people it had fought. And their stories were filled with images of nurses cleaning wounds with gentle hands, doctors stitching carefully, and orderlies who treated them not as enemies, but as men in need of care. These memories circulated through German towns and villages, and shaping perceptions in subtle but lasting ways. The bitterness of defeat could not erase the shock of kindness experienced in those hospital wards. And for many, it became one of the most unforgettable aspects of their captivity. War is remembered most vividly through the destruction it leaves behind, and the thunder of artillery, the blackened ruins of cities, and the silence of graveyards stretching across fields. But within that devastation, our moments reveal a different side of humanity, one that refuses to vanish even in the darkest times. And for German soldiers captured during the Second World War, the most startling discovery was not always the strength of American tanks and the endless convoys of supplies or the skies filled with Allied aircraft, but rather the medical treatment they received in captivity. And it was an experience so far removed from their expectations and from what they had known in their own army that it shook many to their core and lingered with them long after the guns had fallen silent. German medical care throughout the war had been shaped by scarcity and the ruthless demands of total war. And the Wehrmacht did not lack capable doctors or surgeons, many of whom were highly trained and dedicated. But they lacked the resources needed to save lives on a large scale. Medicine was rationed to the point of cruelty, and with penicillin virtually absent from front-line hospitals until the very end of the war, and morphine or other painkillers reserved for only the most critical cases. Bandages were used until they fell apart, and amputations became a grim routine solution when infection set in. Soldiers were treated primarily according to their usefulness to the army, and not their needs as human beings. If a man could be patched up and returned quickly to the front, he was treated. But if his wounds meant he would not fight again, his care was often minimal. And this hard reality conditioned German soldiers to expect little from medical services, and it was with this mindset that many entered American captivity. What they encountered was something entirely different. American hospitals were clean and orderly, and staffed with doctors and nurses who treated the wounded with a sense of calm professionalism that astonished the prisoners. And the sheer abundance of supplies left them speechless. They were accustomed to shortages and to watching their comrades die from infections that could not be stopped. And suddenly they were lying in beds with clean sheets and given meals that felt rich compared to front-line rations and attended to as though their lives held value beyond the battlefield. And the strangeness of this experience left many unsettled, for it clashed violently with the propaganda they had absorbed about the cruelty of their enemies. Nothing embodied this difference more clearly than penicillin. And to the German soldier, infection was a shadow that stalked every wound, turning scratches into life-threatening dangers in their world. And amputations were carried out to save lives, and fevers often meant the end. Yet in American hospitals, penicillin was applied as a matter of course, and an everyday treatment available not only to their own soldiers but even to prisoners of war. Men who had expected death found themselves recovering quickly, and their fevers breaking and their wounds healing in ways that felt almost miraculous. And the routine use of penicillin seemed to the Germans a display of unimaginable wealth and efficiency, and something they could not comprehend after years of fighting with so little plasma and blood transfusions provided another revelation. And the American system for collecting and distributing blood supplies was vast and supported by thousands of volunteers across the Atlantic who gave freely without knowing whose life would be saved. And German captives watched as bottles of plasma were prepared for transfusions, lined up in neat rows, and ready to be used not only for American soldiers but for themselves as well. And the idea that civilians back in the United States had donated their blood for men who had been their enemies just weeks earlier was difficult to grasp. And in the Wehrmacht, such precious resources would never have been used on prisoners, and often not even on ordinary infantrymen. And to see them distributed without distinction between friend and foe challenged everything they believed about war and about the value placed on human life. The recognition of mental health also left a deep impression. And German soldiers came from an army where despair, exhaustion, or emotional collapse were viewed as weaknesses or even crimes. And men suffering from psychological strain were often punished, ridiculed, or cast aside. In contrast, American soldiers were observed receiving treatment for what was called battle fatigue, with time for rest and counseling given as part of their medical care. And although German prisoners did not always receive the same attention, and the very existence of such practices showed them that their captors saw soldiers not merely as tools of war, but as individuals whose minds mattered as much as their bodies. And this realization was both confusing and eye-opening, for it reflected a philosophy of care absent in their own ranks. The generosity extended beyond prisoners to civilians as well. And in towns and villages devastated by bombing and shortages, American medics sometimes set up temporary hospitals and offering medicine and treatment not only to their own but also to the local population. And German families who had expected only cruelty and indifference instead saw American doctors tending to their sick children, providing antibiotics, and sharing supplies. For mothers who had braced themselves for the worst, these moments created memories that endured long after the conflict, and softening the harsh image of the enemy that years of propaganda had built for the prisoners themselves. And the memories of their medical treatment became some of the most vivid recollections of their captivity. And they remembered the steady hands of doctors stitching wounds with care, and the respectful words of nurses who cleaned them as though they were simply men in need rather than enemies, and the taste of hospital meals that seemed almost luxurious compared to the scraps of war. And they carried these stories back to their families when they were released, describing not cruelty and neglect, but unexpected compassion and healing. And such accounts spread through German towns and villages, gradually shaping how entire communities perceived their former enemies. And it was a narrative of contradiction, one that showed that even in the midst of destruction and hatred, there had been moments where humanity broke through the darkness of war.